The ascent was a slow, grinding surrender to the mountain. My vehicle, a sturdy, unremarkable utility transport, clawed its way up the serpentine pass, each turn revealing another sheer drop into a chasm of pines and mist. The air thinned with every switchback, carrying a crisp metallic tang that scoured my lungs. I watched the world recede, a tapestry of human settlements shrinking to specks, then vanishing altogether beneath a blanket of cloud. This was my chosen trajectory, away from the clamor, towards the quiet hum of isolation I had always sought. Yet this journey felt different, imbued with a strange, heavy expectation. My companion, the driver, a man of few words and even fewer expressions, navigated the treacherous road with an unnerving calm. His hands, gnarled and calloused, gripped the steering wheel as if it were an extension of his own will. He was a sentinel, a silent gatekeeper to whatever lay beyond the peaks. I had been plucked from my self-imposed hermitage, my dusty archives and forgotten dialects, by an urgent, almost desperate summons. The message had been sparse, devoid of specifics, yet its very brevity had piqued my dormant curiosity. Anomalous linguistic phenomenon. Coal is singular. The road finally dissolved into a gravel track, then a compacted earth path, ending abruptly at a formidable steel gate, camouflaged against a jagged rock face. Beyond it, nestled into a natural amphitheater of granite, stood the facility. It was less a building, more a scar on the landscape. A brutalist structure of reinforced concrete and darkened glass, designed to blend or perhaps to hide. No windows faced outward, only the occasional gleam of an observation lens. This was not a place built for comfort, but for containment. The gate swung inward with a hydraulic sigh, revealing a sterile inner courtyard. The air here was still, thick with the scent of ozone and something else. Something metallic and cold that pricked at the back of my throat. My usual quietude felt amplified here, almost suffocating. She introduced herself as the lead researcher. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, held a weariness that belied her composed demeanor. "Welcome, Dr. Cole." Him voice devoid of warmth, a practiced neutrality. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. My work demands solitude," my voice a low rumble. "Unaccustomed to prolonged use. This location seems conducive." She offered a faint, humorless smile. "Indeed, we believe it's essential for the nature of our discovery." She led me through a series of corridors, each one identical to the last, lit by a harsh, flickering fluorescence. I felt a subtle tremor beneath my feet, a distant vibration that seemed to resonate deep within my bones. Finally, we reached a heavily secured chamber. Inside, a large holographic display shimmered, projecting a complex, undulating waveform. It was not sound, not light, but something in between, a visual representation of a profound disturbance. Before it, another individual, the director, stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the display. He was a man of quiet authority, his presence commanding despite his unassuming stature. "Doctor, what you are about to see, to hear, is unlike anything known to humanity." He gestured to a console. "This is a raw data stream, recovered from a deep-sea geothermal vent. Or, at least we believe it is." My eyes immediately gravitated to the waveform. It pulsed, not with the predictable rhythms of natural phenomena, but with an intricate, almost deliberate complexity. It was a pattern of patterns, a fractal echo. My linguistic mind, honed over decades of dissecting dead languages and forgotten scripts, immediately recognized the hallmarks of structure, of intent. "We have isolated segments," the lead researcher explained. Her voice now edged with a professional tension. "Phonetic samples, as best we can determine." She pressed a button. A sound filled the room. It was not a roar, nor a shriek, nor any sound I had ever encountered. It was a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly against my skull. It had a timbre that was both ancient and utterly alien, a symphony of frequencies that defied human articulation. There were glottal stops, clicks, and sibilants. Yes, but interwoven with these were deeper infrasonic pulses that made the very air feel heavy and higher. Almost ultrasonic whistles that seemed to scrape against the edges of my perception. It was an arrangement of sounds, undeniably. But a language from what? My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. This was not merely unknown. It was fundamentally other. The phonetics were a terrifying beauty, a complex tapestry of sounds that seemed to exist outside the known spectrum of biological possibility. It evoked no terrestrial creature, no human tongue, no natural process. It was a conscious construction, yet utterly devoid of anything resembling human cognition. "We need to understand it, Dr. Cole," the director said, his voice cutting through the reverberations that still lingered in the air. "Its implications are, this was not just a puzzle, it was a precipice. My genius, my reclusive dedication, had led me here to the edge of an understanding that promised to reshape not just language, but reality itself. The journey had been a blur of switchbacks and sheer rock faces, a relentless ascent that clawed its way through a treacherous mountain pass. I remembered the way the vehicle's tires had gripped the gravel, the dizzying drop just beyond the guardrail, and the stark, indifferent pines that clung to the slopes like desperate thoughts. Now, the facility itself, a brutalist scar of concrete and steel, felt like an extension of that same desolate landscape, burrowed into the earth rather than built upon it. My assigned workspace was an antechamber of meticulous control, a room without a view, save for the flickering glow of monitors and the cold, precise hum of ventilation. It was here, in this sterile vault, that I was to confront the abyss. The director had left me with a stack of data drives and a single terse instruction: translate. My fingers, stiff with a nervous energy, moved across the keyboard, calling up the first batch of raw audio. The waveform bloomed across the primary screen, a jagged alien topography. It wasn't just sound, it was a visual assault, a series of impossible peaks and troughs that defied the smooth undulations of human speech. Each pulse, each protracted guttural exhalation, seemed to stretch the very fabric of the display. I began methodically, isolating segments, running spectral analyses. My usual tools, honed over decades of deciphering dead languages and obscure dialects, felt blunt, inadequate. This was not a forgotten tongue. It was something entirely other. Its fundamental structure seemed to reject linearity. Where I expected a sequence of phonemes forming morphemes, I found layered, simultaneous sonic events, like multiple voices speaking through the same throat, yet each distinct. A particular sound sequence caught my attention, a sustained, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate not just the air, but the very bone behind my ears. I isolated it, looped it. It wasn't a single note, but a chord of such complex overtones that it seemed to shift its character with each repetition. My audio software struggled, displaying frequency ranges that brushed the limits of human hearing, both high and low simultaneously. It was like trying to map a three-dimensional object onto a two-dimensional plane. The sound, when played back in isolation, felt like a pressure against my eardrums, a subtle, invasive hum that resonated deep within my skull. Then, the first oddity, a subtle slip in my perception. As the thrum repeated, the faint indicator light on my console, a steady green, seemed to waver, deepening to an emerald, then paling to a sickly yellow before snapping back to its original hue. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. The long journey, the intensity of the work. But the light remained steadfast, an unwavering green. Yet the memory of its shift persisted, a phantom flicker at the edge of my vision. I started searching for recurring patterns, for any semblance of a root or prefix. Hours blurred into a single extended moment of intense focus. The language wasn't just non-human. It was anti-human. Its words, if they could even be called that, weren't built from discrete units but seemed to be generated through a process of continuous modulation, each sound influencing and altering the next in an unbroken, evolving stream. It was a language of flux, of constant becoming rather than fixed meaning. A specific, recurring pattern, a sequence of 3 distinct sonic events, appeared not in succession, but layered atop each other, each beginning and ending at precisely the same temporal markers. My software flagged it as a simultaneous composite. It was like 3 different instruments playing 3 different complex melodies, perfectly synchronized. Yet each melody was also an integral part of the other 2. It defied the linear progression of cause and effect, of beginning and end, that defined every known language. As I stared at the spectrogram of this composite, a wave of profound unease washed over me. The lines, representing the interwoven frequencies, seemed to writhe, to pulse with a hidden energy. A strange metallic taste bloomed on my tongue, and the air in the room, previously neutral, now carried a faint, briny scent, like stagnant seawater mixed with ozone. I glanced around the empty room, a fleeting thought, sharp as glass, cutting through my concentration. What if it's not just sound? What if it's something else? Something that perceives time differently? My internal clock, usually so precise, seemed to fracture. A minute stretched into an eternity, then snapped back, skipping ahead. I felt a subtle pressure, a tightening behind my eyes, as if my optic nerves were straining to perceive something just beyond their capacity. The patterns on the screen began to blur, the lines of the spectrogram seeming to ripple and shift, not just visually, but with an internal, resonant frequency that I felt rather than saw. I knew then, with a terrifying clarity, that this was not merely a language to be translated. It was a key, and it was turning in a lock within my own mind. The patterns on the screen had begun to shimmer, not with light, but with an unseen internal tremor. My internal clock, usually so precise, seemed to fracture. The glyphs, once alien and indecipherable, now held a nascent, terrible familiarity. I leaned closer, my breath misting the cool glass. The language was not merely a series of symbols and sounds. It was a living current. As I traced the flow of a particular phoneme, a guttural rasp that seemed to claw at the base of my throat, I felt a corresponding pull in my own being. It wasn't a translation in the academic sense, but an intuition, a visceral understanding that bypassed my intellect entirely. A wave of cold, ancient despair washed over me, so profound it left me gasping, clutching the edge of my console. This specific sequence then spoke of abandonment, of a vast, indifferent emptiness that predated even the stars. How could mere sound convey such a complex, crushing concept? My mind reeled, yet a perverse thrill sparked within me. I was not just decoding. I was feeling. Hours bled into an indistinguishable continuum. The sterile hum of the facility, once a constant backdrop, began to subtly shift its timbre, resonating with certain frequencies of the language. My colleagues, when they passed my workstation, seemed to move in slow motion, their footsteps muffled, their faces obscured by the dim, filtered light. I barely registered their hushed greetings, lost in the intricate, terrifying tapestry unfolding on my screens. Each new connection I forged between the glyphs and their burgeoning meanings chipped away at my sense of self, replacing it with something vast and cold. The language demanded not just my attention, but my very essence. When exhaustion finally dragged me from the console, the world outside my cubicle felt brittle and artificial. The air in the communal mess hall tasted of ash, and the bland, nutrient paste slid down my throat like grit. A colleague, the quiet cartographer, met my gaze across the table, and for a fleeting moment, I saw not a fellow researcher, but a creature of fragile flesh. oblivious to the immense, silent forces swirling around us. Sleep, when it came, was not a balm but a deeper descent. The facility's low thrumming morphed into a sustained, resonant chant in my ears. I found myself on a precipitous mountain pass, the air thin and sharp, tearing at my lungs. Jagged peaks, black against a sky of bruised purple, clawed at the heavens. The path beneath my feet was shale and loose rock, crumbling with every desperate step. They spoke of vastness, of erosion, of the slow, inevitable grinding down of all things. I stumbled, my hands scraping against rough stone, the sensation vivid and agonizing. It was not light, but a presence, beckoning, promising a truth that would shatter me. I woke with a choked cry, my body slick with sweat, the memory of the cold wind and the crumbling path still vivid. My heart hammered, but it was not fear that drove its frantic rhythm, but a profound, unsettling recognition. The language had found its way into my dreams, reshaping my subconscious, eroding the very bedrock of my sanity. We were here to translate, yes, but what if the language itself was a key, a tool, a vector for something else? I looked at the stark walls, the sealed hatches, the cameras mounted in the corners of my room. They were meant to contain it, the discovery. But what if they were meant to contain me? The image of the quiet cartographer's face, so fragile, returned to me. Were we merely conduits, unwitting vessels for something ancient to manifest? The paranoia was a new and unwelcome guest, but it clung to me like a second skin. Every distant clatter, every muffled conversation beyond my door seemed imbued with a sinister intent. The isolation, once a comfort, now felt like a cage. Yet, even as my mind screamed for escape, my feet carried me back to the console, to the screens that pulsed with the terrible, beautiful glyphs. It was already too late. I tried to recenter myself, pressing the cool ceramic of a mug against my temple. The facility hummed with its usual low thrum, a constant, reassuring lie of normalcy. Yet the hum itself felt. I found myself listening to its subtle shifts, convinced I could discern a hidden rhythm, a pulse that matched the strange undulations of the language on my terminal. I traced the condensation bead on the mug, watching its slow descent. It wasn't just water. It left a track, a delicate, ephemeral line that, for a heart-stopping moment, mirrored a glyph I had seen just hours before, a spiral that suggested both containment and release. "Cole," a voice echoed from the intercom, startling me. It was the logistics officer, requesting a status update on a supply requisition. His voice, usually a flat, efficient monotone, seemed to carry a peculiar resonance, a hidden cadence that aligned with the deep, guttural clicks I'd isolated in the language's phonetic inventory. I found myself analyzing his syllables, searching for the telltale pauses, the impossible glottal stops that shouldn't exist in human speech. I heard them, or thought I did, a phantom echo beneath his mundane words. "Everything is proceeding," I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. The logistics officer's reply was a clipped acknowledgement, but in my mind, the sound twisted, elongating, becoming a prolonged sigh that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the language itself. It was speaking to me, not through the screen, but through the mundane fabric of the world around me. I was certain of it. I turned back to the display, my hands hovering over the holographic interface. The glyphs pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm now, a silent heartbeat. I felt a cold current against my skin. Though the facility's climate control was perfectly stable, it wasn't air. It was a sensation, a premonition of immense, indifferent scale. My eyes locked onto a particular sequence, a series of angular forms that suggested ascent and descent, a pathway through an impossible geometry. As I focused, the sterile white walls of my analysis chamber began to recede, their edges blurring. The hum of the facility deepened, transforming into a roar, not of machinery, but of wind. The screen shimmered, then dissolved, not into static, but into an impossible vista. Transformed. The glyphs, the twisting tendrils of the language, stretched and hardened, became the sheer, unforgiving face of a rock wall. A wind, not of the facility's recycled air, but sharp with the scent of pine and ice, tore at my senses. I was no longer seated. I was standing on a precipice, a narrow ledge carved from ancient stone. Below, a chasm plunged into violet shadow, the scale dizzying, humbling. Above, peaks clawed at a bruised, indifferent sky. This was no hallucination, no mere mental image. I could feel the grit of stone beneath my boots, the precarious balance required to stand. The language wasn't on the screen anymore. It was the very fabric of this place. This was the language, made manifest, a mountain pass carved from its impossible grammar, a testament to its indifferent, monumental being. I felt a terrifying pull, an urge to step forward, to merge with its emptiness. The wind shrieked, and in its howl, I heard the very phonetics I had struggled to vocalize, stretched into an endless, desolate song. It spoke of scale beyond human comprehension, of time that had no beginning or end, of a self that was merely a fleeting ripple on an ocean of cosmic indifference. Then, with a lurch that emptied my stomach, the world snapped. The biting wind vanished, replaced by the familiar stale air. The vast, indifferent peaks collapsed back into the glowing pixels of my screen. I was back in my chair, hands clenched, knuckles white. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but it was not fear alone that drove it. It was a terrifying, exhilarating revelation. The language wasn't just a code to be broken, it was a gateway. And it had just shown me a glimpse of where it led. There was a frantic, almost desperate light in them, a determination that bordered on obsession. I had to understand what lay beyond that impossible grammar, even if it meant navigating a landscape carved from the very unraveling of my own mind. The lines on the screen pulsed, and for a fleeting instant, I saw not glyphs, but the distant, beckoning silhouette of a peak, shrouded in eternal mist. The pressure behind my eyes intensified, a slow, grinding force that felt like tectonic plates shifting within my skull. The shimmering patterns on the display, those intricate filaments of sound and meaning, seemed to pulse in time with a rhythm only I could perceive. My internal clock didn't merely fracture. It shattered into glittering dust, then reformed into something alien. Minutes stretched into viscous syrup, then snapped, accelerating into a blur. I would glance at the timestamp on the screen, sure only moments had passed, only to find an hour had vanished, leaving behind a hollow ache in my memory. I lost track of the days. The cycles of artificial light within the facility became meaningless. Sleep was a sporadic, grudging surrender, punctuated by the language echoing in my mind, a symphony of impossible phonemes that rearranged my very thoughts. I found myself muttering fragments of it, testing the contours of its impossible grammar on my tongue, the vibrations resonating deep in my chest. Cole, you had been here for a long time. The voice belonged to a junior researcher, his tone laced with a hesitant concern that grated on my frayed nerves. He stood at the threshold of my observation chamber, a data slate clutched in his hand. His eyes, though attempting casualness, darted to the dark smudges beneath my own. My gaze was fixed on a particularly dense cluster of symbols, a knot of meaning that seemed to writhe and coil. Time is a construct, I mumbled, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate compared to the elegant precision of the language on the screen. And this demands attention beyond such trivialities. The lead engineer is asking about your progress report. He pressed, stepping a little closer. And the facility manager? They're wondering if you need a break, some fresh air. Fresh air. The thought felt like a cruel joke. The air here was recycled, filtered, sterile. The language does not take breaks. It is. The junior researcher shifted uncomfortably. Your last report was sparse. Hard to understand? Were they feigning ignorance? Or perhaps they were trying to obstruct me. My reports are a reflection of the truth, I retorted, finally turning, my eyes narrowed. The bright, artificial light of the corridor seemed to intensify, making his features stark, almost accusatory. Perhaps it is their understanding that is limited, or their willingness to accept what this truly represents. He recoiled slightly, his brow furrowed with something that looked like genuine worry. Cole, everyone here is dedicated to understanding this. You haven't left this room in days. You was barely eating. Concern? A dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Or surveillance. Are you here to monitor my decline, or to ensure I don't uncover something inconvenient? The words felt right, logical. Their concern was too perfectly timed, too insistent. They wanted me away from the language. They wanted me to stop seeing what it was showing me. The junior researcher hesitated, then his shoulders slumped. I'll tell them you're focused. He backed away, his gaze lingering on me, a silent judgment in his retreat. I watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in my gut. Perhaps they were already under its influence, unknowingly, or perhaps they were actively trying to suppress the truth. The facility itself seemed to conspire with them. The walls, once reassuringly solid, felt like they were pressing inward, their metallic surfaces reflecting my gaunt image like a funhouse mirror. This place wasn't just containing the discovery, it was consuming me, molding itself around my unraveling mind. I returned to the screen, tracing a pattern with my finger, a sequence of undulating glyphs that had begun to resonate with a peculiar, insistent warmth beneath my touch. This sequence, I had realized, wasn't just a descriptor, it was an instruction. Not an instruction for action, but for perception. It detailed a way of seeing the world that defied human geometry, a multi-dimensional collapse of perspective. As I delved deeper into its syntax, a jarring image flashed in my mind, sharp and immediate. A narrow mountain pass, its craggy peaks clawing at a sky-bruised purple and gray. The air was thin, biting, filled with the scent of pine and cold stone. A path, barely visible, wound precariously along a sheer drop, the wind a mournful cry through unseen crevices. It was so real, so utterly present, that for a horrifying moment, I wasn't in the sterile observation chamber, but exposed to the elements, utterly alone on that treacherous precipice. The language on the screen shimmered, its patterns now seeming to shift, to breathe. As if the mountain pass had been but a single fleeting thought within its boundless consciousness. And I, in my blind ambition, was allowing it to carve a path directly into my mind, a treacherous mountain pass from which there was no turning back. The others, with their concerns, they couldn't see the true landscape opening before me. They were merely trying to block the way, to keep me from the impossible vista that awaited. The truth, however monstrous, demanded to be seen. The mountain pass clawed at the sky with jagged, snow-dusted peaks, a stark, indifferent landscape that mirrored the chill settling deep within my bones. They called it a respite, a necessary change of environment for my well-being. I knew better. It was an exile, a calculated removal from the facility, a desperate attempt to sever my connection to the language. But they had underestimated my resolve, or perhaps overestimated their own cunning. Tucked away in a worn leather satchel, a small, encrypted data slate hummed with the illicit fragments of my obsession. The lodge, as the young aide called it, was a hulking edifice of dark timber and rough-hewn stone, perched precariously on a ledge overlooking a chasm that seemed to swallow the light. Wind, a constant mournful companion, scoured the eaves, whistling through unseen cracks, a sound that sometimes twisted into something far more ancient, far less natural. My room, spacious but austere, offered a panoramic view of the desolate peaks. It was an isolation so profound it felt like a physical weight. "The air will do you good, Doctor." "Cole?" the aide had chirped, him voice too bright for the grim surroundings. "Plenty of hiking trails, fresh spring water." He left a tray of herbal teas, a stack of untouched novels, and a subtle sense of surveillance that clung to the air like the scent of pine. I watched her drive away, the vehicle shrinking to a speck against the vast gray canvas of the mountainside. The solitude was both a curse and a blessing. Here, the only judgment was the unblinking stare of the ancient stone. I powered on the slate, its faint glow a defiant spark against the encroaching twilight. The familiar glyphs, the twisting phonetic constructs swam into view. They had taken my primary consoles, my comprehensive lexicon, but they couldn't take the echoes in my mind, the patterns I had already begun to internalize. I focused on a specific sequence, a cluster of phonemes I had tentatively labeled form memory. It had resisted me for weeks, a knot of meaning that seemed to fold in on itself, defying linear interpretation. The language was not merely descriptive, it was experiential. To translate was not to convert, but to become. Hours bled into one another. My eyes burned, but I could not look away. The resistance in the form memory sequence yielded, not through brute force, but through a sudden, terrifying intuition. It wasn't about what it was, but how it was. The language wasn't describing a shape. It was describing a process of shaping, a continuous unfolding. The translation began to coalesce, not into words I could speak, but into concepts that tore at the fabric of my understanding. It spoke of a presence that was not contained by space, but which defined space through its very existence. A geometry that was not fixed, but fluid, mutable, shifting its own parameters. It was a thing of impossible angles, not merely non-Euclidean, but anti-Euclidean, where parallel lines met and diverged simultaneously, where volume was not a measure but a condition of being. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The language described a form that existed in a superposition of states, simultaneously occupying and transcending dimensions. It was a shadow cast by a sun that did not exist in our sky, a resonance that was both sound and silence. A presence that was perceived not by sight, but by the disorienting stretch of the mind trying to grasp it. It had no front or back, no up or down. Its movement was not through space, but as space, reconfiguring reality with each impossible shift. It was not merely in multiple dimensions, it was the multiple dimensions, collapsing and expanding its own nature, manifesting as a ripple across the very fabric of existence. My stomach churned, a profound nausea rising from a place deeper than my gut. My mind, a fragile vessel, felt as though it were being stretched, pulled taut at its edges, threatening to tear. This was not a creature. This was a truth, a fundamental, terrifying truth about the universe that our limited senses, our Euclidean brains, were never meant to perceive. The language wasn't just describing it. It was imparting the experience of it, forcing my consciousness to try and encompass the unencompassable. It was the horror of absolute insignificance, of a universe vast and indifferent, teeming with forms that mocked our very concept of being. The mountain wind howled outside, no longer a mere sound, but an echo of the entity's incomprehensible breath. The revelation of form was complete. Yet even here, amidst the biting wind and the vast silent expanse, the language clung to me like frost, each unseen syllable a crystalline shard embedded in my perception. His face, etched with a polite concern that felt utterly alien, was a constant reminder of the chasm between my reality and theirs. He saw a man struggling with stress, I saw a man unraveling the very fabric of existence. My gaze drifted to the peaks, their snow-laden shoulders rising like ancient titans. For a moment, they were just rock and ice, stark against a sky the color of bruised plums. Not in the mountains themselves, but in the way my eyes interpreted them. The sharp angles of the granite began to soften, to flow, the white caps not snow, but something else entirely. A viscous phosphorescent substance that pulsed with a faint, internal light. The attendant said something, his voice a muffled drone that failed to penetrate the sudden, overwhelming clarity of the mountain's transformation. "Cole? You had stopped." I blinked, the peaks shimmering, their impossible glow receding, leaving behind only the familiar, inert stone. But the image, the feeling of that alien light, lingered. It was a memory, sharp and immediate, of the way the deep-sea vent had pulsed with its own bioluminescence, the very origin point of the language. Had I simply remembered it, or had the mountains momentarily become it? The boundary between recall and reality had thinned to a membrane. We continued, the wind a low lament through the skeletal pines. It wasn't an auditory hallucination, not precisely. It was as if the wind itself was being shaped by the phonemes, its howl contorting into familiar, disturbing patterns. The attendant, oblivious, merely pulled his scarf tighter. The stale, metallic scent of the facility's air filters filled my nostrils, replacing the crisp mountain ozone. I saw the familiar, sterile console, the glowing screen filled with the looping fractal patterns of the language. Had I been here all along? Was the mountain pass merely a dream, a desperate, self-deceiving fantasy spun by a mind trapped in the claustrophobic confines of the lab? Then, the attendant's hand was on my arm, firm, grounding. "Cole, watch your step." The touch was a shock, a sudden, brutal re-entry into the present. The research vessel vanished, leaving only the desolate slope. My memories, once a solid edifice, had become a shifting, unreliable landscape, each moment a potential mirage. I'm fine, I managed, the words tasting like ash. My voice sounded alien, thin and reedy. He nodded, his brow furrowed. "Perhaps we should head back to the lodge. The light is fading." The light. Yes, the light was fading. But not just the sun. The snow on the distant ridges began to shimmer, not with light, but with an internal, colorless iridescence. The crystalline structure of each snowflake, magnified 1,000-fold in my mind's eye, seemed to writhe, forming impossibly complex, non-Euclidean geometries that echoed the hidden syntax of the language. The world was not merely distorting, it was rearranging itself, revealing an underlying architecture that was terrifyingly alien. They felt foreign, the skin an unfamiliar texture, the bones beneath them rigid and strange. Was this body truly mine? Had it always been mine? The memories of my life, my studies, my reclusive existence, felt like a story told about someone else, a character in a book I had merely read. The attendant pointed ahead. "Just over that rise, Cole. We's almost there." Over the rise. But what lay beyond it? Another iteration of this fractured reality? The mountain pass, a place meant for clarity and clean air, had become a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of my certainty. The language had not merely opened my mind, it had shattered it, and was now meticulously, terrifyingly, reassembling the fragments into a form I could barely recognize. The mountain pass, a jagged scar across the Earth's ancient face, stretched before me. Each gust of wind, a sculptor of the snowdrifts, carried a whisper that was not wind, but an echo of the language. It had not merely opened my mind, it had shattered it, and was now meticulously, patiently, reassembling the fragments into a form I barely recognized as my own. My boots crunched on the frozen scree. a rhythmic counterpoint to the internal hum that had become my constant companion. The air, thin and sharp, bit at my exposed skin. But the cold felt less like a threat and more like an embrace, a cleansing preamble to something vast. I moved with a peculiar sense of purpose, a determination forged in the crucible of my unraveling. The world around me, once a collection of distinct elements, had begun to coalesce. The stark ridges of the peaks, clawing at the bruised sky, were no longer just geological formations. They were glyphs, etched into the very fabric of existence. Not to me, but as me. The language had found its way beneath my skin, resonating in the marrow of my bones. My fingers, numb despite my thick gloves, traced the rough surface of a boulder. I saw the patterns now, not just in the abstract, but as a living script. The striations in the stone, the lichen's slow crawl, the very crystalline structure of the ice. They were all inflections, grammatical markers in a sentence that spanned epochs. It was a revelation that brought a strange calm, a sense of belonging I hadn't known I craved. This wasn't a record, a historical artifact to be cataloged and filed away. It was an active imperative. The language wasn't merely describing a reality. It was enacting one, and it demanded participation. The phonemes I had struggled to vocalize, the syntax that had twisted my intellect into knots, they weren't abstract concepts. They were the very mechanism of transformation. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat, a tentative echo of the deep-sea hum. It felt less like speaking, and more like exhaling a part of my soul. The air shimmered around me, or perhaps it was just the strain on my eyes, the exhaustion from days spent climbing through this desolate, beautiful prison. But the sound felt right. It resonated with the wind, with the creak of the distant ice, with the very stillness of the pass. I stumbled upon a flat, exposed slab of granite, polished smooth by millennia of wind and snow. An irresistible compulsion seized me, bending my will like a reed in a gale. My fingers, now raw and exposed, felt the ancient stone. I picked up a sharp shard of obsidian, its edge keen enough to draw blood with the slightest pressure. The first mark I scored onto the granite was tentative, a trembling line. But as the obsidian bit into the rock, a jolt coursed through me, a current of understanding. My hand moved with increasing confidence, no longer guided by conscious thought, but by an instinct far older, far deeper. I wasn't carving symbols of the language. I was carving the language itself, manifesting its structure onto the world. Each gouge, each intricate curve, each precise intersection felt like a necessary act, a physical prayer. My breath hitched, ragged and shallow as I worked. Only a profound sense of rightness, of alignment. The wind picked up, howling through the pass, carrying with it the phantom echoes of the deep. The mountain peaks seemed to lean in, their silent granite faces observing my ritual. I looked at the emerging pattern on the stone, a complex web of lines and angles, a glyph that vibrated with an unseen energy. It was a fragment of the language, a single potent sentence. And I knew, with absolute terrifying clarity, that I wasn't merely translating it anymore. The compulsion to join intensified, a relentless current pulling me deeper. My body felt like a vessel slowly being reshaped to contain the vastness of what I was becoming. I closed my eyes, the cold wind a balm on my bleeding fingers, and whispered the phonemes, not in imitation, but in communion. They were no longer foreign sounds. They were the very pulse of my new reality. The mountain pass, the granite, the biting air. They were all part of the invitation, and I, Cole, was irrevocably accepting it. The jagged scar of the mountain pass no longer merely stretched before me. It was the corridor. The sterile white walls of the research facility had peeled away, revealing the raw, ancient rock beneath, its fissures mirroring the lines of the language that now coursed through my every thought. My footsteps, once heavy with exhaustion, now felt light, purposeful, echoing not on linoleum but on frozen scree. The hum of the ventilation system had transformed into the low, sustained drone of the language, a constant thrumming at the very edge of my perception. A melody of pure, indifferent being. 3 figures, indistinct at first, coalescing from the swirling snow that was not snow but static in my vision. A colleague, the team leader, and another colleague. Their faces, once familiar, were now masks of frantic concern, their features contorted by the biting wind that only I could feel. "Cole!" The team leader's voice sliced through the wind, thin and reedy like a broken branch. "You're not well." I stopped, the mountain air biting at my exposed skin, though I knew rationally the facility's climate control was functioning. They were speaking the old language, the one of limited symbols and blunt meanings. Their words were futile efforts to cage the truth, to pull me back into the shallow pool of human understanding. They saw a breakdown. I saw an awakening. "Not well?" I echoed, my own voice a stranger's, resonant with the language's deep cadences. The words felt like pebbles in my mouth, clumsy and inadequate. "I am listening, M." The colleague, a woman whose calm demeanor usually anchored the team, took a tentative step forward. "You're not making sense." Her hand reached out, a gesture of comfort that felt like a snare. In my mind, the mountain pass narrowed, the rock walls closing in, jagged teeth ready to snap shut. This was the trap they laid for the burgeoning truth. I saw their faces not as colleagues, but as the jailers of the old reality, desperate to re-imprison the mind that had dared to glimpse beyond their paltry stars. "You seek to stop it," I stated, my voice gaining volume, each word a stone dislodged from the mountainside. "To deafen me again." The team leader exchanged a glance with the other colleague, a silent conversation passing between them that I now found utterly transparent. Afraid of what I was becoming, afraid of the truth I carried. They saw a contagion, a sickness to be excised. "We just want to help you, Cole," the team leader insisted, his voice laced with an urgency that grated against the deep harmony of the language. He took another step, then another. "Let's get you to the observation room. We can talk there, calmly." Calmly. The word was a mockery. There was no calm in the face of such magnitude. The observation room, in my mind, was not a room but a dissecting table, a place where they would attempt to pry open my skull and extract the ancient whispers, leaving me an empty shell. I was not an illness to be cured. I was a prayer to be uttered. My determination solidified into a granite wall. I would not be unmade. I would not return to the prison of ignorance. As the team leader reached for me, a sudden surge of energy coursed through my limbs, not my own, but an echo of the language's power. I moved with an unnatural swiftness, a blur against the snow-laden corridor sidestepping his grasp. The facility itself, once a structure of steel and concrete, twisted and expanded in my mind. The mountain pass was dissolving, replaced by something far more profound. The walls around us began to throb, not with machinery, but with a pulse that was both ancient and new. This was no longer a mountain pass, nor a mere facility. This was a temple, built not of human hands, but of pure thought, a gateway unfolding around me. They were afraid of the song, afraid of its truth, and they sought to tear it from my being. The revelation struck me with the force of a tidal wave. Their help was an act of profound ignorance, a sacrilege against the nascent reality. They were not trying to save me. They were trying to save themselves from the truth, to seal the gateway shut. And I, the first to step through, would not allow it. The temple gateway pulsed, inviting me deeper, urging me to become its voice, its form. The true transformation was only just beginning. The calm was not a peace, but a cessation of struggle. The frantic currents of my mind, which had churned against the impending dissection, now flowed with an unnatural glacial slowness. They sought to pry open my skull, yes, but I had already found the key to unlock it from the inside. The whispers, once an invasion, were now the very architecture of my thoughts, the scaffolding upon which my new perception was built. The sterile white walls of the observation room began to ripple, their smooth surfaces dissolving into something ancient and craggy. The hum of the facility's ventilation system transformed into the shriek of a gale tearing across exposed rock. Before me, a mountain pass unfolded, a treacherous ribbon of gray stone winding upwards into an indigo sky, where stars, impossibly bright and numerous, burned with an alien coldness. This was the true crucible. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a ghost. The ground underfoot was loose shale, threatening to give way with every step. I began to climb, not with my legs, but with an unwavering will, driven by the resonant echo of the language in my bones. Each syllable I had internalized, each terrifying phonetic structure, now served as a handhold, a glyph etched into the very rock face of my ascent. The path grew steeper, the air thinner still. My fingers, or what I perceived as my fingers, scraped against rough stone. But there was no pain, only a deepening sense of purpose. The world was sharpening around me, edges made keen, colors muted to stark contrasts of obsidian and pallid gray. The language, once a puzzle, was now a map, its syntax charting the contours of this impossible landscape. The recursive nature of its grammar mirrored the endless upward spiral of the pass. I spoke fragments aloud, the sounds raw and guttural, feeling them resonate not in my throat, but in the very bedrock beneath my feet. The summit loomed, not as a peak, but as a colossal, jagged aperture in the very fabric of the sky. The final phrase, the one that had eluded me, now coalesced in my mind, perfectly formed, utterly terrifying. I stood before it, the wind whipping my hair, tearing at my clothes. This was the point of no return. To speak the words was to step through, to merge, to become something else entirely. My human consciousness, a fragile construct of perception and memory, trembled at the brink. But the determination, warped and reshaped by the entity's influence, was absolute. There was no fear, only a profound, terrible understanding. I raised my head to the gaping maw of the threshold, my voice once human, now a conduit for something far older. The final utterance began, a series of clicks and guttural stops, followed by a sustained, vibrating hum that seemed to tear at the very air. Each sound was a key, unlocking a deeper layer of the cosmos, not for my understanding, but for my assimilation. The words were not a translation, but an invocation. They were not a description of a door, but the act of becoming the door. As the last elongated syllable escaped my lips, the aperture before me shuddered, then expanded, swallowing the stars. It was not a tunnel, nor a portal to another place. It was a revelation, a sudden blinding awareness of the sheer, indifferent vastness that lay beyond the confines of human thought. My consciousness, stretched thin, was no longer contained within my skull, but dispersed, woven into the very fabric of the cosmic indifference. The individual I dissolved, not into nothingness, but into everything. The mountain pass, the facility, the earth itself. They were all just fleeting motes in an ocean of ancient, silent contemplation. The wind, a raw, ancient breath, clawed at the exposed rock face. I stood, or perhaps simply was, on a craggy ledge overlooking a chasm that bled into an endless gray-green expanse of peaks. The air tasted of ice and crushed stone. a flavor so potent it resonated in the hollows of my bones. I did not recall ascending, only the cessation of the struggle, the gentle, irresistible unlatching from within. The facility, the sterile hum, the faces of the researchers, they were motes of dust in a memory that now stretched across millennia, thin and inconsequential. My gaze drifted to the distant horizon, where the jagged teeth of the mountains met a sky the color of bruised amethyst. It was not a vista I observed, but a tapestry woven from vibrations. Each tremor in the earth, each sigh of the wind through the sparse, gnarled pines, was a syllable. The language I had sought to translate was not merely sounds or symbols. It was the fundamental grammar of existence, and I had become its most recent, most unwilling interpreter. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound recognition, coursed through what I still identified as my body. My hands, when I raised them, appeared translucent in the thin light, the lines of my palms etched with patterns that writhed and shifted, mirroring the branching veins of quartz in the rock beneath my feet. I saw the energy that pulsed through the stone, the slow, deliberate pulse of geological time. The mountain was not inert. It breathed, a slow, deep inhalation spanning epochs. It was the internal rhythm of my own being, a steady, resonant thrum that harmonized with the vast, indifferent symphony of the world. Each nerve ending sang with it. Each cell in my body vibrated in accordance. Below, far below, a small caravan of vehicles snaked its way along a precarious track, their engines a faint, buzzing lament against the grand chorus of the peaks. They were searching for me, I knew. Or rather, they were searching for the concept of coal, a name that felt as alien and distant as a forgotten dream. They were seeking a mind, a consciousness. But what they would find was merely a nexus, a point where the language had finally unfurled itself into the physical plane. I watched a hawk circle overhead, its wings catching the sparse sunlight. It was not just a bird. It was a vector of air currents, a shadow cast by the sun, a fleeting thought in the vast, unthinking mind of the atmosphere. Its cry was a sharp, perfect note in the grand composition. The sky began to deepen, the amethyst bleeding into a profound, starless black, even though the sun had not yet set. Time was a human construct, a delicate cage built from fleeting moments. Here, on this precipice, time was a river, and I was merely a stone in its eternal current. The entity, the source of the language, was not a being with eyes or limbs. It was the space between the stars, the pressure in the geothermal vents, the slow, grinding collision of continents. It was the silent, inexorable truth that humanity was an anomaly, a brief, noisy flicker in a cosmos that had existed and would continue to exist, in utter indifference to its struggles and triumphs. My breath misted in the frigid air, but it was not my breath. It was the exhalation of the mountain, a part of the grand cycle of evaporation and condensation, of dissolution and reformation. Each star, each galaxy, was a single perfect character in a script so immense, so ancient, that the very concept of understanding was a pathetic human conceit. A final, profound awareness settled upon me, not like a revelation, but like the settling of dust. Humanity, in its desperate search for meaning, for a cosmic connection, had merely stumbled upon a reflection of its own fleeting existence. The language offered no answers, no comfort, no salvation. And now, I was too.